Guys, welcome back. I'm going to try to make this short and sweet for us. There's just some information we need to get out to you. Sorry about that little icon there. But with Chapter 9, so we are discussing essentially government policies and fertility and cultural influences, etc. So we're definitely crossing over into more of that societal, sociological realm of demography. So two kind of philosophical camps. One what we call pronatalists. And pronatalists encourage moderate or high birth rates and believe that population growth stimulates economic growth. And there is some evidence to suggest that. Again, part of economic growth does stem from some moderate population growth. Another thing that pronatalists cite is the concern over a growing population of elderly and the kind of the stresses that puts on our social safety nets and so on. Let's move on here. Interestingly, sorry, I'm not doing a good job explaining. I will do better the rest of this slideshow. They tend to also be big proponents of like paid maternity leave, the tax incentives for large families, and subsidized healthcare to make it more easy for people to manage having lots of kids, which does kind of fit in with more of a liberal philosophy with a lot of things. And it's interesting because the philosophical camps for population growth don't necessarily fit into one like liberal versus conservative camp. Now, Malthusian or neo-Malthusians encourage low birth rates and believe that rapid population growth hampers economic development, especially in the developing countries. And they believe that the concern over a growing elderly population will essentially be canceled out by a shrinking population of less. So less money needed for child care, public education, etc. And if any of you guys have read A Brave New World by chance, you would notice that they wear Malthusian belts, and that's their birth control method. So that's where that Malthusian term comes from. Anyway, side note. Now, of course, people of the neo-Malthusian would be more in line with more of the environmental movement because they believe that the rapidly growing population is going to cause some resource depletion and cause the human population to exceed its carrying capacity. All right. Also we're pointing out, often inaccurately associated with things like eugenics and other kind of sinister ideologies. And that's not accurate at all. Proponents of the neo-Malthusian thought are not promoting like taking genetic cleansing and another Holocaust. That is not at all what they point out. It's more about trying to get people access to birth control to help lower, moderate birth rates in certain parts of the world. So some people kind of sensationalize neo-Malthusians as being Hitler-like, and that's not at all the case. Very, very small percentage of people are like that. So again, we come back to should governments take measures to control population growth? And what measures should they take? What's their purview in this regard? So a couple quick things. No one camp is right necessarily. There's definite objective truth in both camps. Okay, but we're gonna explore this now. So first of all, it's difficult to meet basic needs in developing countries. That is not news to you guys. There are problems associated with overpopulation, not the consumption overpopulation, but just straight up overpopulation. Infrastructure or what have you in place isn't enough to meet the needs of the people living there. So it's not a matter of overconsumption. It's a matter of just not having the materials or resources in place to meet their needs. So that is actual overpopulation. And that's associated with environmental degradation, hunger, economic stagnation, urban deterioration. Okay? Those are things we see in our developing countries when overpopulation is an issue. Okay? Now, again, some of this technology could really help mitigate, but it's still a problem. Reminder, what carrying capacity means: the maximum number of individuals a given species that a particular environment can support for an indefinite period. What what we've seen happen in situations of overpopulation is we actually decrease what would normally be the carrying capacity. That number becomes less because of land degradation. All right. So as far as trying to calculate the actual correct carrying capacity of the Earth, really, really difficult to do because technology is kind of an X factor. Whether we're able to care for our land appropriately so that we can maintain certain productivity levels, or whether we degrade the land so that it can actually support fewer individuals in the long run. It's really difficult to wrap our minds around that. We just don't really know for certain. Some people have very sinister ideas and are pessimistic about it. Some people are very optimistic about the role technology can play there. But there really isn't a good answer for what the carrying capacity of Earth is for humans. Population and chronic hunger. So where we have overpopulation, so not enough resources to meet everybody's needs, of course we're going to end up with chronic hunger and food insecurity. So this is a condition in which people live with chronic hunger and malnutrition. And it's worth kind of pointing out that, there's people in the U.S. who don't have enough money to go to the grocery store and buy food. In these types of countries, even if you have money, you may not be able to get the food that you want because there's just not enough food available. They can't just take the money that they might end up with and go to the grocery store and buy it. It's just a different reality for these folks. And when we have people living with chronic hunger, we get a weakened immune system, developmental delays, and all kinds of things. And these are things we'll actually talk about in our chapter on food and growing food and agriculture. But these are just worth pointing out at this point. Solving the food problem. When we look at international efforts, the number one goal is to control population growth. Now, let's be really careful. We're not saying stop population growth. We're not saying impose a certain number of child. We are trying, I say we, like I'm involved in this. I guess I'm a teacher about this. But the powers that be are essentially trying to moderate population growth would probably be a better way to say that. Okay? In order to promote the economic development of developing countries that don't already have adequate food supplies. Because again, technology and infrastructure can really help to mitigate some of those problems. But if you have a rapidly growing population, it's like trying to work with sprinklers while the sprinklers are on. You gotta slow one of those variables down so that they can mitigate one thing at a time. All right, and then we can think about providing access to food and land resources to those who live in areas without them. All right. So if you look at the globe, where would you see the most rapid or pronounced malnutrition? Of course, it shouldn't come as a surprise to you that big parts of Africa are where that's most likely. You notice that Southeastern Asia has some important places as well, but it's the continent of Africa that's really, really struggling with malnutrition. And a lot of that, by the way, isn't because Africa doesn't have the resources. Actually, a lot of it comes down to politics and political strife more than anything else, which is interesting. So economic effects, right? So going back to those two viewpoints, population growth stimulates economic development, technological innovation versus rapid expansion hampering developmental efforts. Most observations support this. Okay? And again, it's not that the pronatalists are wrong. There is some merit to the argument that population growth does help stimulate economic growth. It's just it can't be too rapid. So we shouldn't really, based on the data we have, it's not worthwhile to really incentivize really large families. But at the same time, there is some evidence to suggest that maybe we shouldn't try to prevent people from having children or more than one child like it did in China. That didn't work out the best for parts of China economically either. Okay? So, the middle road maybe is the answer. Again, these experiments are still just kind of being done. Developmental efforts too, though, past development attempts are kind of hurting people. So it's kind of like countries have already gone bankrupt, and so they find it harder and harder to get loans to help pay for the development in the first place. But that's where like the World Bank and so on could maybe chip in a little bit to help those countries out. All right, total fertility rate. Now this is a term I want you to be able to define. Total fertility rate refers to the average, number of children born per female. All right. So notice Germany is 1.3, USA is 2.0, and Niger 7.9. We have large discrepancies. Germany, being post-industrial, has a very low birth rate. So over time, in the absence of immigration, we would expect that population to decrease over time. The good old US of A is at 2.0, just barely under that replacement level. Our population continues to grow, however, because of immigration. Whereas in Niger, we see a whopping 7.9 total fertility rate. And they are kind of pre-transitional at the moment and have a relatively high death rate. But if Niger or Nigeria likewise has a very similar birth rate as they go through those transitions, again, remember, we're going to see that birth rate remain high and the death rate plummet. And so we'd expect really rapid population from countries like Niger or Nigeria in the future as they undergo development. All right, so how do we go about reducing total fertility rates? There's kind of three influences here. There's cultural, there's social and economic, and then of course there's adequate access to family planning. First of all, I want to point this out. The number one issue dealing with fertility rates is status of women. Okay, this is the number one indicator right here. Okay, in countries where women enjoy a high status and a high level of education, we see reduced fertility rates across the board. Now, the reasoning for that is they generally, because they're seeking out education before they have children, they just tend to have fewer children because of the timeline, but also because they tend to be more professionals. They don't want to have as many children to care for and have to pay for childcare and so on. So it's more of just a natural offshoot of women enjoying a status that's close to or equal to that of men. And of course that ties in with cultural traditions and access to family planning as well. But the number one indicator of fertility rates is the social and economic status of women. All right, sorry about that. So cultural influences people's behaviors, right? Some religions promote a low marriage age. Some religions promote having lots of kids. So examples that you guys would be familiar with, the LDS religion and Catholics are definitely in that pro-natalist camp for religious reasons. And so sometimes a couple is expected to have a large number of children for cultural reasons, or just to make up for the really, really high infant mortality rates that we see in our pre-industrial countries. And sometimes children are an asset. So when you're doing subsistence farming, for example, having the extra hands in your house to help with labor and generate capital is important. Okay, these are all things that contribute to high fertility rates. Okay? Now, if you look at the single most important factor affecting high fertility rates is women, right? If you look at the literacy rates, there's a strong correlation between the literacy rates of women and fertility rates. Okay, so let's look at countries where we have a really high percentage of illiteracy. All right, these countries, right, we would expect to also see really high fertility rates. So places like Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Egypt, and India, right? The women, there's a large disparity between the men and women in terms of literacy rates. In those countries is where we tend to see really high fertility rates associated with that. If we look at in the U.S., right, we can look at fertility rates. Let's look at not high school graduates. We have fertility rate approaching 2.8. High school graduates, we're at a 2. A bachelor's degree, 1.6. And a post-bachelor's degree, about 1.3 or 1.4. Right? So there is an inverse relationship between between the amount of education women have and the average fertility rate. Now, of course, how do we prevent fertility rates in the first place or lower them? It's not that people are going to stop doing what they do, right? It is access to family planning services, okay? Namely contraceptives, okay? Even in the U.S., there's a disparity in regions of the U.S. where contraceptives are more frowned upon for cultural reasons. We see fertility rates go up. Interestingly, we also see the number of abortions go up in counties where they're very anti-abortion. It's an interesting statistic. Anyways, that's a side note. But yeah, having access to contraceptive is the really only effective way to help reduce fertility rates. And we can see from here, right, the percent of married women using modern contraception in Nigeria, right, in that green bar is really low. Their fertility rate, very high. Whereas in Germany, we have a very large percentage using contraceptives and a very low fertility rate. Go figure. I apologize. This lecture was by no means my best work. I'm sorry about that. I was in a little bit of a hurry to make sure we got this in. I'll have to do a better one for this unit for next year. But anyways, I wanted to keep this short for you and just introduce some really important things. You guys will be able to interact with this stuff a little bit more tomorrow. But again, I am sorry that I didn't do my best work lecture-wise this time.